very much, Patty, for that wonderful introduction, and I'm delighted to be here today to talk about my new book. As I said, Titans of Industrial Agriculture, which just was published a couple of weeks ago. And I'm really delighted to be here with my wonderful colleagues to talk about this book. It's just a real pleasure to have Sarah, one of my former PhD students here, and Anastasia, my current PhD student, and of course, Bruce, bringing his historical expertise into the conversation. So this book, it's about how we ended up with just a few corporations controlling agricultural inputs. When what I mean by that is farm machinery, seeds, pesticides, and fertilizer industries. And it was striking to me that if you look back 200 years, these industries were not even commercial industries. These items were not traded. Farmers recycled materials on the farm for their fertilizers. They saved their own seeds. They usually fashioned their own tools and equipment. And they dealt with pests in ways that were more natural, let's say. And yet, in this period of time, since around the mid-1800s, we have seen enormous consolidation and concentration in this sector. So in terms of the book, that's what I'm trying to understand. Now, as you can see, the book is quite fat. It's over 400 pages. It spans 13 chapters. There's absolutely no way in 25 minutes that I'm going to be able to cover all of the arguments in the book. But what I would like to do is give some broad brushstrokes. And I apologize if I go quickly through these broad brushstrokes, but hopefully we'll have time in the Q&A to get into more depth and into issues people might be interested in. So in terms of what I'd like to do in this presentation, and first I will just explain what this image is. I found this image at the Waterloo Public Library, and it was it's a picture of a combine harvester that was actually built here in Waterloo, just a few blocks away from here on the site where the Luther Village is, on near Father David Bauer Drive, but also it was on a street called Sunshine Avenue. I always wondered why that street was called Sunshine Avenue, and I would walk along it and it was full of potholes, rarely cleared of snow. It was a real hazard to walk down that street in the wintertime. And then one day, as I was researching this book, I came across the first line of an article talking about the Sunshine Waterloo factory. And then the alarm bells went off in my head and I realized it was at that site. Anyway, and I love this image. But what I'm going to do is talk about why I wrote this book. The main arguments, I'll spend most time on the main arguments because there's several. And then lessons for policy and scholarship from this work. So why I wrote this book. I wrote this book because I've long been interested in corporate power in the agri-food space. And this interest, I would say, goes back at least 30 years, if not longer. I wrote my PhD dissertation on agricultural topics and power in the global economy. And when I started my teaching career, this was when agricultural biotechnology was just taking off, and there was a lot of activity going on, let's say, around concern around the rise of agricultural biotechnology, and it was being controlled by just a few companies. So I've been tracing these issues for many years and very, very interested in it. But in the time, since the early and mid 1990s, when we saw that activity on ag biotech, we've seen growing concentration and consolidation in the global economy more broadly. I put a graphic here of the value of mergers and acquisitions worldwide from around 2001 to 2024. And as you can see, there are ups and downs, but it's quite significant value in terms of trillions of dollars of worth of companies teaming up together to form larger companies. And this has happened across many sectors. We hear a lot about big tech, but it's also been happening in pharmaceuticals, insurance, asset management companies. We're seeing this conglomeration or consolidation of power in the global economy and how its impacts are spilling over into our wider aspects of life, including ecological and social dynamics. And I'm very interested in food and agriculture, and I was seeing the literature, especially on the rise of big tech, and thinking, we're not seeing enough analysis on the rise of big agriculture in the farm sector. Yet this is an industry that has deep, deep roots, and I wanted to see what lessons we could learn from it. So I've been long interested, but what really sparked me to write the book when I did was a slate of mergers that happened after 2015, and you might be familiar with some of these. One of them in late 2015 was announced when Dow and DuPont said they would merge and form three new companies, one of which is called Corteva, focused specifically on agriculture inputs. Another was the announcement by ChemChina that it was going to purchase Syngenta. That was in early 2016. And this, I have a plus and an equals here because this company merged together and then they were acquired by Sinochem. And it's one of the biggest chemical companies in China, but still operates to some extent in the Western world under the name Syngenta. Then we saw Bayer acquiring Monsanto, and this merger was in a sense a response to these other mergers, which is now Bayer, which swallowed Monsanto and its assets. And then as these mergers were winding their way through the regulatory process, many of the states told these other companies they had to sell off parts of their business in order to get regulatory approval, and BASF, one of the other big chemical companies, stood ready to buy up those bits. So it bought bits of these other companies. And then at the same time, we saw a massive merger in the fertilizer sector. And these are two Canadian companies. We saw Agrium buying up Potash Corporation, forming a new fertilizer company called Nutrien, which is now one of the biggest fertilizer companies in the world. And so I was really interested in trying to understand what was driving these most recent mergers. What is going on? And in the background, I should mention too that the big machinery companies like John Deere and AGCO, they were buying up smaller startup digital companies at the same time, expanding into new areas and engaging in these mergers and acquisitions. So what we ended up with is today we have these giant groups of companies. I mean, they're dominated by just 4 dominant companies within the seeds and pesticides, fertilizers, and farm machinery. And those several companies in each of those sectors controls a significant proportion of the market. So when we look, for example, at the seed industry, the top 4 firms globally control around 60% of the global seed industry. But when you drill down within countries, it's even more pronounced. So in North America, for example, when we look at soy, maize, or canola in the Canadian market, around anywhere from 80 to 90% of those markets are actually controlled by just 4 companies. It's the same in the pesticide industry. Globally, they control around 70% of global pesticide sales, but when you drill down nationally, it's even more pronounced. The top 4 farm machinery companies control around 50% of the global agricultural machinery market. But in North America, John Deere, just one company, controls 60% of the heavy-duty tractor sales in both Canada and the US. And then in the fertilizer sector, we also have seen considerable market domination. This sector is a little bit different from the others where this concentration is most pronounced at the national level. So just to give an example, 100% of North America's potash is coming from just a couple of these companies. And in terms of nitrogen fertilizer, just 2, Nutrien and Mosaic, control 75% of the North American market. So it's very, very concentrated. So I'm trying, in terms of why I wanted to write this book, I wanted to understand why those most recent mergers were happening and what it means. But I took a bit of a historical turn in writing this book. I started out trying to write a historical chapter to understand all of these sectors in one chapter, and I ended up writing 40,000 words. So that ended up being a big chunk of the book. But I would say that historical turn was inspired in part by reading the work of Louis Brandeis. I was fortunate to have a sabbatical year in 2019 when I started work on this book, and I got kind of interested and a bit lost in reading about Louis Brandeis's ideas, because there's a new movement of antitrust called the Neo-Brandeisians, and I wanted to understand, well, what was Brandeis actually saying? And he wrote a great little booklet called Other People's Money and How the Bankers Use It. It's almost as if you're reading about today when you read that book, but it was published in 1914. And I love this quote from him. He said, "Size, we are told, is not a crime, but size may at least become noxious by reason of the means through which it was attained or the uses to which it is put." In other words, what he's saying is size can be problematic if it is attained in certain kinds of ways, and also if the firms that gain that size use that power they gain from it to ill ends. And Brandeis was very, it was very prescient about what we're seeing, I think, in the global economy today. And one of his big issues, even back in 1914, was his concern that corporate consolidation and power was undermining democracy. And that just sounds so familiar in today's context. We're seeing a kind of a resurgence of the kind of moment that was happening in the early 20th century in North America when we had, the Gilded Age and control by big monopolies. And so, what I also found inspiring about Brandeis is he said that we're not going to understand how this happens unless we do deep dive studies into specific sectors to understand how these firms got big in the first place. Because once they get big, it's kind of this propulsion that they stay big. And so I wanted to understand that process, and I wanted to do it in this agricultural input sector. So that's a big part of why I wanted to write the book. So in terms of the arguments that I want to talk about, it's this first question that I'm going to spend some time on of how did these firms get so big in the first place? And I'm including here some advertising materials from a number of the companies that I researched in terms of writing this book. And a lot of these companies, well, some might seem familiar to you, like John Deere, or maybe even Massey Harris or Dow, but others might not be as familiar, like Funk Brothers or the McCormick company, or even Pioneer. And that's because these companies got bought out by other companies. But what we can say about today's big firms that are dominating the market, you can trace their lineage going back to these early companies. And that's sort of what I really tried to do, spent a lot of time trying to do in writing this book. So how did these firms get so big? So the main companies today that are merging, and we saw this when Dow and DuPont announced their merger, or when Bayer announced its acquisition of Monsanto, they want us to believe that firms got big because they were more clever, they were innovative, they had a good idea, they were more efficient, they were managed better by better CEOs, they, basically were better at doing what they did, they were providing products that everybody wants, and that they naturally just grew to be big. And therefore, we should praise them for their, service to humanity. And I wanted to sort of investigate how much of that mainstream story that we're getting from industry is actually the case. And when you dig deeper, of course, it's not always so simple. It's not just that these firms were bigger because they were better at what they do. They were bigger for a host of reasons. And I will talk about those very, very briefly here. One of the big factors of why those firms were able to get so big in the first place has to do with what I call market dynamics. This is the first factor. The image here is of the McCormick Reaper Works around 1902. You can see how giant this factory is. And that would help explain, part of what the, modern day CEOs would tell you is that they're bigger because they're more efficient. And that's because in economic terms, they could benefit from what we call economies of scale. You simply got bigger outfits, you could reduce the products at a lower marginal cost per unit. That's a simple explanation. But that explanation doesn't go very far, because you can get too big. You can get so big that you're inefficient. It doesn't explain everything. So what else is going on here? What I found in investigating these firms is they had privileged access to finance. These were wealthy business folks, and they were hobnobbing with the bankers and financiers that were providing them credit to acquire their rivals. So there was mergers and acquisitions going on because of this access to finance. It was very privileged to certain actors and not available to others. There was also from the beginning pressure from investors in these companies to merge and acquire rivals so that they would get bigger and make even more profits. And these are all kind of dynamics that we're continuing to see today. And another factor that was really important historically, especially before there were regulations to prevent this kind of behavior, was manipulation of the market through collusion and other means, whereby firms were actively working in various ways to keep competitors out of the market. They were dominating markets by exerting all kinds of activities, collusion on prices, or other kinds of barriers to entry with others. So market factors, they are indeed important, but again, they're not everything. Technological drivers have also been important in explaining the rise to bigness of these firms. This is a picture of the Fixed Nitrogen Research Laboratory in the US in 1926, and I chose to show this image because it's an example of one of the huge technological changes in the sector, the synthesis of nitrogen through, the creation of ammonia that's the basis for modern day nitrogen fertilizers. That was a massive change technologically that gave a leg up to the companies that were able to acquire the know-how and how to do this. So in terms of technological drivers to business, what we saw and have seen throughout history is transformative innovations both inside and outside the sector that have led changes within agriculture. And it's not as if the companies that were at the forefront of these technological innovations were necessarily even the ones coming up with them. They were the ones able to buy them in many cases. And that pattern goes way back in history, and we're seeing it today. But they were able to be at the right place at the right time to capitalize on these technological changes. And these industries and firms have also benefited from what we call technological lock-ins. And I don't have tons of time to get into that, but a lot of these inputs, all of these inputs, interface with one another, seeds, pesticides, chemical machinery, in a way that once you adopt one part, you have to adopt the whole suite of them. And so if you mechanize your farm, you're going to have to move towards monocultures, you're going to have to use towards, fertilizers, you're going to have to use hybrid seeds, et cetera. So like this lock-ins have tended to benefit the terms at the top. And also there have been throughout history what I call mergers of technological progress, and that's simply the incumbent firms buying up the new innovative firms and folding them into their business so that they can capitalize on those innovations. So technological drivers have long been important. They continue to be today, as we see with the rise of digital agriculture, genome editing, et cetera. Startups in these sectors are being bought up by these same companies. A third key factor in how these firms got big in the first place has to do with a policy context. And this, and I chose to give an image here of, the hybridization of corn and how that worked in terms of the breeding. And I just want to stress that original research was done by the US government. It wasn't done in the seed companies. The seed companies were able to acquire that knowledge from government R&D and then work in ways to put that innovation behind intellectual property protection that enabled them to profit. They didn't come up with it on their own. But this is typical across these sectors. We've seen government support to firms in many ways, not just this kind of R&D, but also through subsidies and other kinds of government policies that encourage the adoption of industrial agriculture. States also have put in place policies that protect intellectual property that allow these firms to basically have a monopoly over new inventions for a period of time, typically 20 years, that enable them to get bigger. And also what we've seen is antitrust policies often failing to keep up with the pace of these kinds of acquisitions and mergers, and especially since the 1980s, we've seen weak antitrust policies that have basically allowed these mergers to take place. So the policy context really matters. So that's a big section or theme of the book, is that these three things really matter. It's not just one or the other, it's all three of them, and they all reinforce each other. So what we've seen since that time in the sector is some interesting changes. In the 1980s and 90s, we saw the big seed companies, which used to be, Funk, Pioneer, DeKalb, and what was the fourth one? Pfister. They all got bought up by big pesticide companies, and then we ended up with ag biotech, a new technology, right? So now we only have three lines or three strands of these firms instead of four. We also saw massive consolidation of fertilizers as well as in farm machinery. And a big company I mentioned here, International Harvester, it was the product of a merger of over 7 firms in 1902. It controlled 85% of the farm machinery market in the US. It actually went bankrupt in 1985 and got bought out by others. So what we've seen is change, yet continued pattern of consolidation. And I'm just going to give a very brief peek at what some of my hard work went into the book and late at night during the pandemic, tracing the early companies to the current ones. And you can see we did go from many smaller firms in the pesticides industry to just 4 big giants today. And there was this change throughout that time. But it's striking that even by the early 1900s, in this particular sector, by the 1930s especially, we already started to see major forms of consolidation happening. So consolidation of course, it's ongoing and it's new, but it's also old. It's been going on for a long time. And we're now facing a situation where we might actually be seeing those three lines of firms converging into one. And this is a big concern many activists have, because what we're seeing is all of these industries are making heavy investments in digital and genomic, digital farming and genome editing in ways that overlap their businesses in new ways that could result in further consolidation into a big one-stop shop set of industrial agricultural input firms. Okay, so why does all this matter, and how do these firms benefit from being big? They benefit from being big because it gives them different kinds of power. And that's another big theme in the book. And I chose this John Deere ad. This is a real John Deere ad. This was from when they came up with fossil fuel powered tractors, and they called it power farming back in the day. And when I saw this image, I was like, this is so great, because it's exactly what I'm talking about, but in a different sense. And so I want to talk about three different kinds of power that these firms were able to acquire from getting so big. One is the power to shape markets. So at the same time that market dynamics enabled them to get big, it also enabled those firms to shape those very same markets. It gave them the power to shape technological trajectories in the sector. So in other words, even while technological change spurred some of these mergers, those firms that were at the forefront were able to shape the future direction of technological innovation. And it also gave these firms the policy to shape policy and governance. So while the policy context allowed them to get big, as they got bigger, they were able to shape that policy context through various kinds of strategies. And so power is extremely important for understanding, in a sense, why it matters that these firms got so big, because it allows them to stay big and to exercise that power. So I'm just going to give some more modern day examples of how these firms are doing this. They're shaping markets in a variety of ways. Just to give a few recent examples, John Deere is under investigation right now, for example, for constraining the market for farm machinery repairs, because these are highly digitalized machines now. They're not allowing farmers to fix their own tractors anymore. They're actually saying you have to get it fixed by an authorized Deere dealer, and that is seen as controlling the market, so they're being investigated for that. There was also concern about fertilizer profiteering. After the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, what we saw was a lot of disruption in global markets, including food markets, and as food prices rose, interestingly, so did fertilizer prices, partly because Belarus and Russia produce fertilizers, but farmers were concerned that the fertilizer price was going up much more than their costs were going up for the inputs, and they saw that as profiteering. They're also being investigated for this kind of behavior, and their profits did, as you can see from the graphic here, go up quite, fertilizer prices rather went up quite a lot, and as I show in the book, their marginal profit rates soared through this period. And also the pesticide industries, Syngenta in particular, and Corteva are under investigation right now for paying incentives to input retailers for keeping generic brands of chemicals off the market. In other words, to privilege their own products. So this idea of how these firms have been shaping markets, it goes way back and it continues today. And they have, the more consolidation and power they get, the more ability they have to shape these markets. There's also this issue of shaping technologies. Basically, with the rise of ag biotech in the 1990s, what we saw was the big firms that were dominating at the time were engineering seeds to be resistant to certain kinds of herbicides, and that shaped the technological trajectory of farming towards this herbicide-centric model of farming. And that has continued, and we've seen, by the way, a huge increase in the use of herbicides as a result of this change. And this is continuing with the rise of digital farming and the rise of genome editing. These are becoming very dominant technologies in the field, and they're also reinforcing a herbicide-centric model. They're not just editing seeds to be resistant to herbicides, they're actually trying to edit weeds to make them resensitized to herbicides. It's complicated, but it's not moving us away necessarily from herbicides. It's digging it down more deeply. And they're shaping policy and governance in important ways. They're through lobbying. For example, these big ag companies are among the top 10 lobbyists in North America in terms of the amount that they spend. They're engaging in revolving door where their CEOs end up in regulatory jobs and then back in the company. You know, they're shaping governance that way. And it's just enormously influential. Like in Canada, when Canada was assessing its fertilizer regulations, the fertilizer industry in Canada met with government representatives on average every couple of days. And we know that from the lobby registries. But they're also engaging in partnerships. There was a lot of concern around the Crop Life International, which has all the members of these same companies as members, having a partnership with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. They sponsor scientific studies. We saw this with Monsanto sponsoring studies on glyphosate safety, just as governments were seeking to re-regulate and approve it for continued use. And they also have enormous discursive influence. So there's lots of ways in which the power of these firms is shaping what the food and agriculture sector looks like today. And I want to talk a little bit about how this matters at the end of the day. And this graphic is kind of, it's in the book, but it's kind of a summary of this part of the argument. But as you can see, through the exercise of market power, technology power, and political power, we see these kind of impacts on prices, impacts that keep competitors out of the market, impacts that direct us only to profit-oriented innovations, and undue corporate influence has all kinds of consequences, from higher costs for consumers, limited autonomy, and higher prices for farm inputs for farmers, fewer entrepreneurial opportunities. I mentioned already the technological lock-ins, the externalization of costs, and it undermines democratic participation and reinforces inequalities. So there's a whole host of impacts that come from this kind of exercise of power, and that's why it matters. And I don't know how much time I have, Patty. A few minutes.
You know, it's your show.
My show. All right, I'll just give a few examples of some of the costs that I talk about in the book, because I don't have time to go into great detail. But I just want to say that this picture is a picture I took. It's like about an hour north of here, and it really struck me as I was driving past a couple summers ago to see this. It's winter wheat being harvested, and the barn there is falling down. And for me, it was just very symbolic of this rise of industrial agriculture. And I since have been past that same spot, and now the barn is completely flat. But anyway, in terms of the direct costs, as I mentioned, these higher costs can threaten farmers' livelihoods and make things more expensive. This autonomy, what we're seeing is what many scholars are calling a de-skilling, that farmers are losing, in a sense, touch with how to breed seeds themselves, how to deal with pests in natural ways, you know, and again, how to fix their own machinery. And this loss of autonomy is really emphasized in the rise of digital farming, where farmers now are often, to take advantage of digital technologies in their tractors, for example, they have to sign away the rights to the data about their own farms. And so they're losing even the ownership of the data of their own fields. And the technological lock-ins also make it really hard for farmers to transition to more sustainable practices. As I said, once you adopt one aspect, it's hard to let go of others. They kind of come as a package. And it's kind of scary for farmers to consider shifting completely away from these modern technologies, because it's in a sense, there's not a lot of competition of other firms that are providing more intermediate or less high-tech kinds of inputs. And so the result is a continuation of a reliance on a herbicide-centric model that threatens health and threatens the environment. And I just want to stress, because I got lost in the history in writing this book, that there are wider costs beyond the ones that I just mentioned, and many of these costs have long been recognized. I mean, here's a suite of books that, you know, all came out in the early 20th century that were basically criticizing the rise of industrial agriculture as it was happening. And those were really important critiques. As you know, Paul Sears' book, Deserts on the March, was about damage to soils and the rise of the Dust Bowl. That was published in 1935. Anna Rochester's Why Farmers Are Poor, that was published in 1940. She's talking about the problems of displacement from land and descaling from the rise of mechanization. Eve Balfour's The Living Soil, you know, again, critiquing the rise of fertilizers, and Edward Faulkner's Falman's Folly was about the problems caused by overplowing of soils. The War in the Soil by Sir Albert Howard was again very much focused on seeing like Eve Balfour, soil as a living entity, and he was very critical of the big corporations even in that book. And also, as we're much more familiar with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring from 1962, where she decried the pesticide companies. But I just want to say, like, Rachel Carson's work, extremely important, but it was following these other really important works as well, all centered on this critique. So, you know, this issues of displacement from the land for mechanization, and that includes indigenous peoples being displaced from their lands with a spread westward in North America of this kind of farming model in the first place, and then displacement of poor and Black farmers from the land, especially in the US, as mechanization further spread. Soil damage and fertility loss. There's also a lot of concern about biodiversity loss from monocultures that was written in the 1930s, toxic pollution and pest resistance, and then more recent concerns, because these concerns remain relevant. We're now recognizing the extent to which this model is responsible for climate change, and also how new farmers are finding it very difficult to access land because it's become so concentrated and consolidated. So this has, you know, there are all kinds of consequences that come from the domination of this sector by just a few companies that brought us this industrial model. So I'll quickly try to wrap up with the policy lessons. In the book, I talk about policy in the final chapter and what we need to do about these many problems resulting from these dynamics. And one is simply the need for stronger competition policies, or what they call in US antitrust policies. Policies that prevent firms from getting so big in the first place, that would stop these mergers and even could break up some of the big firms and make them break up into smaller entities that would make a more competitive market. There are so many ways in which competition policies have been weakened over the years, and they need to be made stronger. This is a recommendation that's outside of the agriculture sector itself. It's got to happen across the whole economy more generally. And what we saw in December, for example, was improved recommendations or competition policies in Canada and also in the US. But now there's been a change of admin in the US, and who knows how what's going to happen, whether things will get stronger or weaker. But we also need more public support for alternative agricultural models. I would say so much of that early transition to industrial agriculture was on the backs of government research that brought us that model, and now we see the consequences. But in the meantime, states have stepped away, and most agricultural research right now is done by corporations, and they don't want to bring us a model that doesn't rely on their products. But we need models that, like agroecology, that are low external input technologies that are more sustainable because of these ecological concerns that we have about industrial agriculture. And we all, again, here's another recommendation. It's outside of agriculture per se, but we need better policies to counter the corporate capture of governance in general and food systems in particular. So conflict of interest policies, you know, policies that create democratic participatory councils at the local level so that people have more voice and they're not drowned out by corporations that dominate the discussion. And then what are the lessons for scholarship? And I'll just say this is an image from the Grangers. That was a movement in the 1870s that was really trying to take power back from the corporations. And I do love this image. I mean, the Grangers weren't necessarily that successful in their quest, but that's for another book. But in terms of what I think my contributions are in scholarly terms, I think what I'm trying to do in this book is to show that corporate power in the agri-food sector has deep roots, and it can provide important insights, not just for within the food system, but within the economy more broadly. And so I really try to shine a light on those deep roots and to learn those lessons. I also think we need wider conceptions of corporate power. I myself have written about corporate power and focused mostly on the political aspects, some extent on the economic aspects. What I really learned in writing this book is the significance of technology power, and I think we need to bring that more fully into our conversations about power in the global economy. I also, this was the first book to look at all four of these sectors together. I think that's why it was such a hard book to write and why it took so long. But it really, for me, showed the importance of technological lock-ins and illustrate how these lock-ins happen across the different inputs in the input sector. And I'm sure that's a similar case in other areas of the global economy as well. I also trying to bring forward the insights from examining this interaction of market, technology, and policy factors, which is a framework I borrowed from Susan Strange's work, where she talked about, the need to look at all of these things to understand power in the global economy. And I think it brings us a more nuanced understanding of food system dynamics and power in food systems. I mean, a lot of the literature that is out there on food systems and power is focused on mostly the market dynamics, mostly, food regimes and sort of pointing to capitalism. And I'm thinking, like, what I tried to do in this book is disaggregate capitalism into these technology, market, and policy factors. So I hope I made that contribution. And also a final contribution that food systems transformation, if we're going to achieve it, we have to address corporate power. And a big push for me was the Food System Summit in 2021, which was a UN effort that was trying to come up with all these ways that we can transform food systems, and they barely talked about corporate power. In fact, they let corporations in the room and be part of the conversation. Civil society walked out because they didn't include corporate power as part of their messages. And I wanted to show why it matters. Okay, so with that, I will finish and say thank you, and I hope I didn't talk too much.
So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jennifer, for inviting me to be a panelist today. When Dr. Clapp asked me to be part of this panel, I was very honored to be included alongside these other distinguished panelists and felt genuinely excited at the opportunity to delve deeply into her new book and share some of my thoughts and reactions. Through this book, Dr. Clapp demonstrates the value of tracing the processes and strategies through which corporate power within the agricultural input sector has expanded and permeated our food system over time, and the importance of understanding this if we want to enact change to transform and dismantle the structures that these corporate entities in their position, or that keep rather these corporate entities in their positions of power and that continue to marginalize groups including farmers, workers, among many other actors. Dr. Clapp provides such extensive detail and quite impressively traces the ways that big corporations within the agricultural input sector have carefully and strategically garnered power over time, the implications of this, and potential policy tools that we could consider to address the issue. The degree of detail that Dr. Clapp provides in tracing the history of the accumulation of power and influence allows readers, whether you're familiar with the topic or not, to get a strong sense of the impressive and somewhat sinister ways that these corporate actors have strategically operated over time, building what I sort of envision as like castles or fortresses around themselves to ensure that the global industrial food system remains reliant upon their products, and that they remain relevant and one step ahead of those who may wish to push food systems in a different direction. Dr. Clapp very poignantly demonstrates that while corporations have invested heavily into technological innovation and potentially disruptive farming technologies under the auspices of improving food systems, they remain largely focused on maintaining their power, profits, and steering discussions around agriculture and food away from truly transformative models of food systems that may not be as profit-oriented, but more in alignment with the conception of food as a human right, and the acknowledgement that there are ecological implications to the industrial model, as well as the non-food related benefits that alternative approaches to food production may provide. While delving into significant detail, Dr. Clapp still manages to effortlessly paint an overarching picture of what the agricultural input sector looks like in terms of these corporate giants and their power and influence, and what this has meant through time for shaping our food system, as well as the risks if we allow agribusiness as usual to persist. I wanted us to take a few minutes to also talk about the main takeaways that I got from the book, with a little more attention to the second half that was focused on kind of the contemporary context and potential policy opportunities for mobilizing change to address the concerns around corporate power and concentration. So firstly, Dr. Clapp very effectively explains how the different types of power, market, technological, and political, that corporate entities have accrued in the agricultural input space are intricately connected, And this issue points to serious questions around how we disentangle these power dimensions and their relationships, and asks readers, researchers, and advocates for food systems change to consider how we might take a holistic approach to addressing these concerns, because they all ultimately feed into each other and amplify the influence that these corporate entities have overall. Another key takeaway that I got from the book was the degree to which farmers and food producers around the world are continuing to have their agency threatened, and the risks that agricultural technological innovations pose in terms of exacerbating this issue, or they may pose. And this really reiterated to me the importance of supporting farmers, civil society, and Indigenous peoples groups and food movements with promoting and exploring alternative models for food systems, and developing policies that protect them from the impacts of corporate power and concentration, especially with respect to protecting and potentially in some instances reinstating farmer agency, autonomy, and sovereignty, and particularly in the tech space when it comes to data, knowledge, and information. This issue is something that I am particularly interested in, and this book has given me much to think about in terms of ways that policy from an agricultural inputs lens could more meaningfully engage with those most affected by corporate power in these industries across global, regional, national, and local contexts. I thought a lot while reading this book about the power of technology to also streamline approaches to food production and the sociocultural implications of this, especially where informal food economies continue to be dominant, and the potential indirect threats that technology led by big agribusiness could pose to the fact that food systems encompass more than just the food itself, but also contribute to vibrant cultures, community cohesion, and diverse livelihoods. And lastly, Dr. Clapp provides a critical view of the role of the public sector and the clear need for more transparency, accountability, and active investigation into the issue of corporate power. Dr. Clapp highlights that there is increasingly more impetus to address the issue, and has been like a long history of efforts, but that more attention is needed within the public sector to address this issue within agriculture at large, and that it needs to be more actively considered, discussed, and critiqued openly. While reading the final chapters of this book and thinking more broadly about the increased recognition of alternative approaches to food production, such as agroecology, territorial markets, and rights-based models, as well as the increased concern around agricultural technological innovations and the ecological implications of the industrial model of food production at present, but also the ecological implications of tech innovation as well. Dr. Clapp leaves readers with a challenge to investigate and reflect on the question of how we want to see our food systems change moving forward, and prompts us to meaningfully consider the importance of addressing corporate power and concentration if we want to enact meaningful change. So to close off, while I'm slightly alarmed by some of the things I learned in this book, and really surprised by the long-standing history of corporate concentration that extends rather a lot further back than I had imagined in my head. I'm also deeply inspired by her work, in particular investigating more into agricultural technologies and big agribusiness investment into this space and its potential impact on smallholder farmers and informal food economies are something I feel a new level of urgency to explore. So thank you, Dr. Clapp, and I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks to Anastasia. Thanks to Patty for the introduction. I'm really delighted to be here back at Wilson School and back around among colleagues. So the first time I saw Jennifer present was at Carleton, and I think I was either a senior undergraduate or a master's student. It was 2007, 2008, and she was looking at corporate power. She was looking at grain traders in the wake of the financial crisis and the food crisis. And I was hooked. It was amazing. As you can well see, she's masterful at this. So I'm particularly delighted to be here and talk about her fat book. And I'm delighted that she's reclaiming the word fat. Okay, so this book is what Robert Cox would call a historical inquiry, a focus on change and continuities, and it begins with puzzles. It begins with a series of puzzles, actually. Why these companies? Why this form of agriculture? Why these contradictions and tensions of a given world order? Importantly, how does power operate? Specifically, how does corporate power operate? So the book, as we heard, highlights market power, technology power, and this shaping the influence over policy and governance. So in the wake of the US election, not sure if you heard anything about that, and the ascendance of a new generation of technology titans in the form of tech billionaires, it is crucial to think about what Clapp has called bigness. Or Brandeis, as we learned, called noxious, and how corporate power operates. What Strange and Cox also called business civilization. So recently, Masha Gessen describes something called bully power. The unbridled power that is dangerous and often violent. Are you going to believe your lying eyes, or are you going to believe Bayer and Monsanto about the role of glyphosate? So this book traces corporate power, and I'm going to sort of work through the question, what does the corporate control and corporate consolidation of agricultural inputs do? What does it do? Now, of course, Jennifer touched on this towards the end of her presentation. But I'm going to focus on three aspects of this. I'm going to focus on material transformations, industrial work and metrics, and fast and slow violence. So on material transformations, corporate consolidation sounds great. It consolidates. Wow, that sounds terrific. But it's premised, this corporate consolidation and industrial agriculture is premised on massive material transformations. Industrial agriculture breaks apart collectivities. Think of terraforming, mining the soil, machines that break soil collectivities, churning the soil with plows, compressing the soil with tractors that cost $500,000. That weigh over 25,000 kilos. I looked that up this morning. I was shocked at the number, how big those things are. Reworking the soil with potassium, nitrogen, phosphorus, the different kinds of fertilizers that are used. Moving mountains, moving islands of guano for fertilizer, moving fossil fuels from one end of the earth to another. Breaking ground, indeed. These material transformations produce a specific hierarchy of life and death. The second thing I want to look at is industrial logics and industrial metrics. The model of inputs and outputs. So Clapp here is looking at agricultural inputs. The model of inputs and outputs are made legible through metrics. But not all lives and not all relations can be subject to metrics. There are lives and relations that are resistant to metrics. They cannot be measured. So while soy production may increase as farm size increases, rural communities' well-being declines and hollows out. Collectivities, communities are broken by this model. The third thing I'd like to look at is something fast and slow violence. What Clapp's book does in a really interesting way is show the marriage between the history of agricultural inputs and war industries. So for example, nitrogen, the synthetic nitrogen and ammonia is also used in explosives, right? And so during the First World War, there was the massive increase technology-wise, but also political-wise, to increase artificial nitrogen that was also used in explosives. So you see this marriage between war industries and agriculture, industrial agriculture, in a very particular way through the book. So we have this marriage between war industries and agricultural inputs that it's long-standing. And DuPont, in the early 20th century, was rightly named a merchant of death. Death is an integral part of herbicides. Death is an integral part of pesticides. And what is so ironic is that the major industry association is called Crop Life. We think about these industries as life sciences, and yet they're really pesticides, herbicides are really about killing things. Of course, there's also not only fast violence, there's also slow violence. Pesticides and the slow violence of pesticides and herbicides is well documented. The question is how to repair. How to repair what has been broken apart? How do we confront bully power? So in the book, there's a number of and Jennifer outlined these points in the presentation, but we have a lot of work to do, and I'm particularly concerning reading all of the recent anti-competitive or antitrust measures that have been documented in the book, but thinking about the change, especially in the US, what this means for corporate power is particularly concerning. So I'd like to thank Jennifer for the invitation and thank Jennifer for the thank you.
Hey, well, I got the impression of Jennifer, and she stood up there earlier on that I was supposed to deal with the historical part of this, but I haven't done that. So maybe being a historian, I find Jennifer's second half of the book to be very, very compelling and interesting. I make a brief reference to history, for sure. And clearly, this is an impressive book, put up mildly. It's a real contribution to the literature, as I'm sure everybody who's even looked at it up here would realize too. It's exhaustive in explaining the rise of, she puts it the titans of industrial agriculture. That fact alone makes it very difficult. Jennifer told me 7 minutes originally, but then she upped it to 10. I don't know if we're in a sort of negotiation. You were pulling your trump card at that point. We're negotiating about this. So 7 to 10 minutes, very difficult to respond in 7 to 10 minutes to the sort of adequately to its breadth, depth, and insightful interpretation about the facts. It's therefore necessary to touch down very, very lightly, it seems to me, in my commentary. As you will see, I've done this in part where Jennifer and I come together, intersect in our interpretations, not because I like talking about my stuff necessarily, but because I'm relieved to know that I'm at least on the right track here. So the book is, it seems to me, based on really deep research, of course. I think the pages of references, maybe 50. That's almost a whole book in some people's eyes. Very useful interpretation of the data that yields significant benefits, of course, to readers and researchers. A welcome condemnation of the organizational ethos presently widespread in the agricultural world of go big or go home, an organizational paradigm that led, as she points out, to industrial agriculture. Books also focus through its use of the four main agricultural inputs that she talks about: machinery, seeds, fertilizer, and pesticides. And the companies that grew to Brobdingnagian proportions, I had to practice that word a few times, over the 20th century, sometimes peddling some of these goods, sometimes peddling more than one in as monopolies or duopolies. She also documents how each of these products could be connected in some fashion to the destruction of the environment, the air, to possible long-term health implications of owners and employees exposed to these effects, and to a whole lot of other issues as well. I also, and this is where the history stuff comes in, like the fact that early on, Jennifer notes that it's necessary to have an appreciation of history to really understand the complexities of our current predicament, in quotation marks. History as a subject of critical inquiry, of course, it's been downgraded at universities, and it as yesterday's subject. It literally is yesterday's subject, but even so, it probably should have a higher place in the pantheon of departments than it does now. I agree with Jennifer. It's really necessary to understand the complexities of almost any current issue to understand the historical antecedents that go into the current situation here. She also lays out very well how we got to here, that is 2025, from there, the 19th century. It's also not a pretty story by any standard. We've gone from agriculture to agribusiness in a really disastrous way, it seems to me. So as noted, as I've said, there is so much to comment on in Titans from the policy factors passed into law in capital cities around the world that allow these industries to prosper, to the very fact of their bigness and their ability to stay that way on the road to monopoly or duopoly, to the cost of this corporate concentration is imposed upon society, on the environment in the future. As Jennifer writes, quote, by encouraging farm consolidation and higher prices, the Titans model contributed to highly unequal access in a number of areas. It's also led to enormous ecological problems, such as soil degradation, a narrowing of agricultural biodiversity, pollution from the overuse of pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers, and a huge increase in greenhouse gas concentration, all of which have significant human health consequences. So as I mentioned to you at the beginning of my remarks here, there is much that overlaps with my present work, and I'm working with a colleague from McGill on this work on dairy and eggs in a transnational perspective, which admittedly are not nearly as compelling as Jennifer's actors. Dairy and eggs can only take you so far, I think, not like BASF or Bayer for the most part. In those sectors too, the emphasis is on bigness, and it seems to represent some sort of protection from the vagaries of the market, which I think is what you've talked about in yours too, Jennifer. Indeed, as I came close to the end of Titans, I wondered if there was some sort of achieving template for achieving bigness. I don't know if it comes through Harvard Business School case studies or the Wharton School after Trump's demolished that as well, to some extent. These, you know, maybe they have a secret handshake, these big firms, or something about how to get big in their areas. But when I first read that you wrote, the dominant firms grew big largely through mergers and acquisitions made possible by their privileged access to investor finance and the primacy of shareholders within industrial capitalist markets. And that mirrors, I have to say, I've written my stuff before I read that, so it's not plagiarism or anything like that, but it does, there's a certain similarity, I think, so an approach to this in terms of modern agriculture, which goes back 50 years or 70 years or whatever. So as I say, this mirrors almost precisely the wording that my colleague and I use in describing a mergers and acquisitions situation in Australia with respect to the two big supermarkets, the chains that have so degraded agriculture. This is a whole other area as well that I think maybe we should talk about this in the future, Jennifer, too. Degraded agriculture in Australia as well. So we wrote, Coles and Woolworths had been part of a Get Big initiative too. If competition and productivity were increasingly emphasized, the two supermarkets took the government message to heart. It's been promoted by government as well, that they have to get big in order to survive. They had also been gobbling up their competitors since the mid-1960s, and they had a number of advantages that they used to good purpose. Importantly, their advantaged access to capital allowed them to increase their market share because they were able to raise funds at a lower cost than their smaller rivals and had greater leverage in their balance sheets. These funds enabled them to build their store numbers more rapidly and in gaining access to the best sites, creating barriers to entry in local markets and to spend more heavily in advertising. So that seems like the template for bigness, I guess, if whether you're a John Deere or a Woolworths in Australia. So as I say, they're probably not as interesting as BASF and Bayer. Their impact on their captive populations is equally pervasive and perverse. It seems to me the power and influence they all wield has propelled them forward on this on their path to titanic status. So getting big seems to be the tried and true method of survival in almost any sector that emphasizes technology or food. It's also the case in the American dairy and egg sectors with dairy farms of 10,000 milking cows and layer farms of 6 million birds, not unusual. Jennifer wonderfully highlights the importance of political lobbying as crucial to the success, if one can call it that, of these agribusinesses, their conglomerations. It would seem that the size in the sectors Jennifer writes about has been more than met with size, but on a slightly different scale in many of the sectors that use those inputs, like in particular in the United States and in certain countries of the European Union. And the same effects follow as she documents. Market distortion, profit by the few, helped along in this case with massive public subsidies from government and policy and regulatory influence that helps no one but the company at issue. In the case of my work, these corporations are epitomized in concentrated animal feeding operations, which are exempt. These are huge farms. They're not farms, they're facilities, more or less. They're exempt from US clean air and clean water legislation. So literally, what an environmental mess. Where Jennifer writes that corporate-led agricultural models have contributed to wider social, ecological, and health impacts to soil degradation and pollution, I can only agree. In the case of my research, massive hog and poultry barns equipped with giant exhaust fans push pollutants such as ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, volatile organic compounds, and particulate matter out into the atmosphere. Air pollution from animal farms, and this came as a bit of a surprise to me, doing some of the research, is linked to almost 8 times more premature deaths the premature deaths then from coal-fired plants, according to a 2021 study from Johns Hopkins University. Other research has found that living near a factory farm, and these are the people who use the inputs that Jennifer's talked about, is positively associated with the risk of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and leukemia, and people who live near them report higher rates of headaches, depression, anger, and respiratory symptoms such as asthma. I bet they do. These CAFOs are enabled by Jennifer's Titans to some extent. One has promoted the other. It also seems that as these few giant corporations came to dominate the farm sector in some countries at least, and as I say, the US and certain countries, Denmark, for example, is oddly enough a massive, is a country that favors massive agriculture at the expense of the smaller. So farms in that country and region got bigger. The mega factory farm is a major mega corporation producing fertilizer, seeds, and pesticides, the inevitable consequence of decades of agricultural policy that has incentivized growth at all costs with few guardrails in place to protect the people who live near them, or to protect those farmers who use the equipment from the ravages of the massive global corporations that affect their every breath. As she also points out, market power can beget political power, for sure, with the obvious attendant downsides. That does seem to be happening today, especially, and we could talk about the last 6 weeks if you'd like, or 2 months, or anyway, with Trump. But also with Biden and with Obama. You know, it's not Trump alone who has followed this path. As she writes, the firms at the top of the Titans heap have, quote, used the power available to them to shape food systems in ways that serve their own needs first rather than the needs of society more broadly. Will this continue? Difficult to say. You know, Jennifer speaks of policy change, of farmer unions becoming more activist in search of alternatives and more sustainable agriculture. And right-thinking governments in various countries, you know, maybe becoming more thoughtful about the need to right-size agriculture, whatever that means. Jennifer mentioned, you did mention the Biden administration specifically in this effort. But will this, I'm almost done, well, will this welcome return to a more sensible and sane world bear fruit without the latest fertilizers and herbicides? Jennifer outlines ways in which this salubrious development could happen in her last chapter through competition law reform, change in market structures, to stronger measures to combat our current corporate influence and ensure accountability. I think Jennifer is hopeful here, but I wonder about this recent US Supreme Court case, Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. You know, then President Obama stated the decision gives special interest in their lobbyists even more power in Washington. Mitch McConnell, who I think of as one of the slimiest senators in Washington, welcomed it. So I think that says everything we need to know about Citizens United. So finally, I sincerely hope that Jennifer's take on this is accurate in your last chapter. Anyway, there will be some change, or hopefully change, and that industrial agriculture and those companies that keep it going will become yesterday's worry. Still, I would be remiss if I didn't thank you for ending Titans on I thought, a relatively optimistic note, given all that had gone before. And it is a pretty thick book too, of depression in some cases, you know, with the technological advancement and all sorts of other things. But you did end it on a relatively optimistic note. Otherwise, we could all be doomed, I think, here. So congratulations on this amazing accomplishment or achievement. I'm sorry, I can never remember which word is a good one, you know, one's better than the other. So I should Titans will further solidify your reputation at the top of academia, and I dare say as a leader of public criticism of an unsustainable model of agribusiness and industrial agriculture that we in the West presently adhere to. It's a position of authority, I think, that you deserve, and I know you will wear it very well. So thanks very much, Jennifer.